Right, you nine. For this third recording, I'm going to look at Lennie. Okay, so number one, behind him walked his opposite. Remember, try to put the quote into context, like what, when, and roughly it was said, without just retelling the story. Just show off to the examiner that you really know this novel. Okay, so what's my point to build a Pete paragraph? Okay, my point is that Lennie relies on George. He represents the theme of companionship, friendship, or you could say the idea, another point you could make is that this idea of disability, of being mentally limited, or he is one of the disempowered or weak in the novel. There's a couple of points you could say, yeah? But the idea that he's reliant on George, he's dependent on George, as shown when it states, behind him walked his opposite. This suggests that he is a follower, isn't he? He constantly follows George because he can't look after himself. He's not independent. Why is this? Remember the 5 W's. You don't always have to ask yourself why 5 times, but even saying, well, why is that the case from the quote? Why is he dependent on George? Well, it's because he's mentally limited, isn't it? That he can't think for himself. So he has to follow George, and he copies George a number of times. Exactly when George bends down to drink some water, Lennie copies him exactly, because even the most simple things he needs to look to George for guidance. And this sort of reveals as well about their relationship, because they're so close. They travel around together. So it reveals about their relationship that it's like a father and son relationship, isn't it? It's close. He looks to George as a sort of role model, someone that he sort of looks up to, and he looks for guidance on how to just live. And that really emphasizes, well, for George, that George has got a tremendous amount of responsibility, because at this time in history, and this is our sort of link to time, for 2 men to be traveling around was extremely rare. The nature of being a migrant worker is that you tended to travel around on your own, because following the Wall Street crash, the Great Depression made work very scarce, as in there was incredibly high levels of unemployment. Job contracts were very short. Jobs were obviously difficult to come by. You had to travel all across the country looking for work because of events such as the Dust Bowl, the droughts in central USA. People travelled west to California, to places like Salinas, looking for work on the more rich greenery and ranches of California. Okay, so that's the idea that it's that friendship they have. It's very, very rare, this sort of friendship. And that's sort of similar in terms of, if we talk number 2, I forgot George. But again, you could talk this idea that the point, it represents mental disability, that he's very limited, as shown when Lennie says, I forgot George. This suggests that he struggles. He's so forgetful. He struggles to remember small details. Start with the basics, by the way, year 9, and then build it, go deeper, really dig down for meaning. Because he's so forgetful, he's extremely reliant on George. Yeah, this causes trouble for George and Lennie. Obviously, George has to take on even more responsibility to remember things such as their work cards that Lennie feels that he's forgotten. It's going to mean as well for the plot of the story that the Lennie is going to end up dying because of forgetting the lessons George has told him. He's just incapable of remembering. And so that is also signals by the end of the novel the death of the dream, because Lennie can't remember. So what's the link to time here? The link to time, if we're talking about the mentally disabled, George is essentially, in their relationship, is like a carer for Lennie, isn't he? He's a carer for Lennie because at this time in history, there wasn't really provision or care for people like Lennie, who was very mentally slow, very mentally limited. The care, well, if you want to say, suggest the care that actually was there for them, for people like Lennie, was extremely harsh and not appropriate, and just poor for him. Places like insane asylums where he wouldn't have been treated with dignity or respect, but more like a prisoner in a prison. Okay, let's have a look at, should we look at number 3? I pinched their heads a little and they was dead. Okay, what's our point here? Our point here is this idea that Lennie, again, it represents that he's mentally limited. That's the theme. The idea of prejudice against people with mental disabilities. And we can see this here in the quote, I pinched their heads a lot and they was dead. Okay, so here we're told about the fact that Lennie doesn't have control over his strength, yeah? Also, you could talk about this as the theme of power. That Lennie is physically powerful, but this power that he hasn't got control over it. That makes him extremely dangerous because he's got this childlike mind, but in the body of an extremely powerful adult man, yeah? Fully grown adult man. And that lack of control is going to mean the death of Curly's wife, isn't it? And obviously that symbolises the death then of Lennie and George's dream. That obviously also includes Candy. The real concern here, when we zoom in on this quote, is that it's so matter of fact the way Lennie says it. He doesn't really appreciate life in the sense of killing something. Not appreciating almost the value of life here means that when he kills the puppy, his panic is that he doesn't want to upset George, not that he's killed a puppy. When he kills Curly's wife, it's the same idea. He says, "Oh, I've done a bad thing," but it's not so much essentially he's taken a life that he's worried about. He's upset George, so it signals that for someone like Lennie with a mental disability, he's not going to get better. The dream, and again, you could argue it in terms of represent the theme of dreams. The dream isn't going to happen because Lennie, in this time in history in the 1930s, has not got the support necessary to be able to achieve the American dream. And George just has too much to do in terms of being able to look after him. It's just almost an impossible job to look after someone with such profound learning needs. Okay, so you could say then just Steinbeck is conveying the message that at this time in history, for people like Lennie, the mentally disabled, life was so difficult and it was a bit hopeless to achieve their dreams. Could we talk about just one more? Let's talk about quote 4. We could live off the fat of the land. Okay, so what's this showing? You could argue that this is represent the theme of friendship. You could say it's represent the theme of dreams. Again, you could always, it's a number of things you could say, but remember, you want to say three Pete's, which talk about 3 different sort of points, don't you? 3 separate points. So if I've done one point on dreams, and my focus on the character of Lennie, I want my next point to be on the theme of friendship, my next point to be on the theme of prejudice in terms of mental disability. So keep your points varied. So maybe I'll do the idea of dreams here, right? So dreams. It represents the theme of dreams. We could live off the fat of the land, yeah? This suggests that the dream of owning a small place between Lennie and George, it's dependent on each other, isn't it? On their friendship. And then zoom in on the word we. It's that collective pronoun, that idea that they have to do it together. It's about the two of them achieving it together. And then when we talk about live off the fat of the land, linking to time as well, this idea that for migrant workers that were constantly moving around, to live off the fat of the land, to live off a piece of land that was their own, they can put down roots. It was so difficult for them to form friendships, to stay in contact with their families. It was a very lonely existence. So to have land of their own that they were almost permanent residents on, they didn't have to move around. That was really really fulfilling, really gave a sense of stability to them. That's a really worthwhile dream, and that's what Lennie and George want, their own place they can call their own. They're not employed by someone, they're not under constant fear of being canned, of being sacked. It's their own sort of little place. To then talk about the idea of Steinbeck's message here, Steinbeck's message is, this is such a humble, such a small dream, to have their own place, to farm their own land that's their own. They're not employees of an employer. But it's not achievable for these migrant workers because of the nature of the Great Depression. If circumstances were too difficult. As he's critical, Steinbeck is, of the dream. As hard as these men work, they will not achieve this dream. There are just too many obstacles in the way. Whether it's Lennie's mental disability, as we have here, that where people just have not got the understanding to provide support, so it's not simply George having to look after him. Whether it's the fact of trying to get enough money, or trying to take on obstacles of people trying to assert their power and intimidate, like Curly looking to ruin and to stop people like Lennie and George achieving their dream, or the view of someone like Curly's wife who ruins men's dreams, this idea that women ruined men's dreams. And obviously Steinbeck presents that as a being quite critical of that sort of sexist notion that women were the causes of destroying men's dreams. Okay, I'll pause it on Lennie so we haven't got too much. So you got roughly 10 minutes per character I've talked about so far. Okay.